Start. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes bishop, check. Knight takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen takes bishop, check. The puzzle is solved using knight takes pawn. King takes knight. Queen to e3, check. King to f1. Bishop to g3. Let's continue. The threats are knight takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes pawn. Checks in this position are knight to e7, check. Knight to f6, check. The answer is queen takes bishop. Queen takes queen. Knight to e7, check. King to h8. Knight takes queen. One more. The threats are bishop takes rook. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to h1, check. The answer is rook to h1, check. King takes rook. Bishop takes rook, check. King to h2. Rook takes rook. Let's continue. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes rook. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes pawn. The checks are rook takes pawn, check. Bishop to f8, check. The answer is rook takes bishop. Rook takes rook. Bishop to b2. King to f8. Bishop takes rook. Let's continue. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes queen. Queen takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Checks in puzzle position are queen to f7, check. Queen to h7, check. Queen to h8, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is rook takes pawn, check. King takes rook. Rook to g1, check. Queen to g5. Rook takes queen, check. Next puzzle, the threats are queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn, check. Pawn takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using bishop takes pawn, check. King takes bishop. Queen to a5, check. King to b1. Queen takes rook, check. Another puzzle. The threats are queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Knight to e6, check. Knight to f5, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using rook to c7. Queen takes rook. Knight to e6, check. King to g6. Knight takes queen. Another one. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes bishop. Queen takes pawn. Knight takes pawn, check. Knight takes rook. Knight takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. The checks are knight takes pawn, check. Knight to f1, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook to g2, check. Answer to this puzzle is rook takes pawn, check. King takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Bishop takes pawn, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is bishop takes pawn, check. King takes bishop. Knight to e5, check. King to g8. Knight takes bishop. Let's continue. The threats are queen takes rook, check. Here are the checks. Knight to f6, check. Queen takes rook, check. Rook to h8, check. Answer to this puzzle is rook to h8, check. Bishop takes rook. Rook takes bishop, check. King takes rook. Queen to h6, check. King to g8. Knight to f6, checkmate. Let's continue. Threats in puzzle position are rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. The checks are rook takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes pawn, check. King takes rook. Bishop takes pawn, check. King to g6. Queen takes queen, check. Let's see the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are bishop takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are bishop takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using bishop takes pawn, check. King takes bishop. Knight to g4, check. Another one. Threats in this position are queen takes knight, rook takes rook, rook takes pawn, rook takes knight, bishop takes bishop, bishop takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are rook to h1, check. The answer is bishop takes bishop, king takes bishop, rook to h2, check, king takes pawn, rook takes queen. Another one. Threats in puzzle position are knight takes bishop, pawn takes pawn, bishop takes knight, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Knight to d6, check. Knight to g5, check. Bishop takes knight, check. Bishop to g2, check. Bishop to h1, check. Bishop to e2, check. Bishop to d1, check. The answer is bishop takes knight, check. King to e8. Bishop to h5. Queen takes bishop. Knight to f6, check. King to d8. Knight takes queen. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes queen. Queen takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Knight to f6, check. The best move in puzzle position is queen takes queen. Rook takes queen. Knight to d6. Rook to b8. Knight takes rook. Another puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. The checks are rook to d3, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is rook to d3, check. Queen takes rook. Knight to c5, check. King to c3. Knight takes queen. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Rook takes rook, check. The checks are queen to e3, check. Queen to c5, check. Rook takes rook, check. Solution to the puzzle is rook takes rook, check. King takes rook. Queen to c1, check. Queen to e1. Rook to d1. Let's continue. Threats in this position are bishop takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using bishop takes pawn, check. King takes bishop. Queen to h4, check. King to g1. Queen takes pawn, check. Next, the threats are rook takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are rook takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is rook takes pawn, check. King takes rook. Queen to g6, check. King to e7. Rook to e1, check. King to f8. Rook to f1, check. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes bishop. Knight takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. The best move in puzzle position is knight takes pawn. King takes knight. Knight to e4, check. Another one. Threats in this position are bishop takes pawn. Here are the checks. Rook to c8, check. Queen to f7, check. Queen to f8, check. The best move in puzzle position is rook to c8, check. King to h7. Rook to h8, check. King takes rook. Queen to f8, check. King to h7. Queen takes pawn, checkmate. Let's continue. Here are threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. Checks in puzzle position are queen to d8, check. Queen to h7, check. Queen to h8, check. Rook to d8, check. The best move in puzzle position is rook to d8, check. Bishop to f8. Rook takes bishop, check. King takes rook. Queen to d8, checkmate. One more. Here are the threats. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes bishop, check. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes bishop, check. Rook takes pawn. The checks are queen to h2, check. Queen takes bishop, check. Rook takes bishop, check. Rook to f1, check. The puzzle is solved using rook to f1, check. King takes rook. Queen to f2, checkmate. Let us go to the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. The checks are: rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to d2, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The answer is rook to d8. Pawn takes bishop. Rook takes rook, check. King takes rook. Rook to d8, check. One more. Here are the threats. Queen takes knight, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen takes knight, check. Queen to b7, check. Queen to c6, check. Queen to a6, check. Bishop to b7, check. Answer to this puzzle is queen takes knight, check. King takes queen. Rook to a8, checkmate. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.